Okay, sixth graders, we are going to read chapter 13 called Class Dismissed. You might remember Fazula had put down his edict that said girls are done going to school on that specific date in January. And so in the last chapter, we were kind of edging towards that date. Malala had started writing a diary for the BBC, which is an international publication. It's kind of like ABC News, Fox News, any of those kind of big news channels that we have in the United States. It's like those. So the BBC was a pretty big deal. And if you remember, her dad actually had revealed the fact that she was writing a diary for the BBC secretly. So it had gotten to America. So people were finding out what was going on in Pakistan. And now, of course, with the title of Class Dismissed, we assume that this week, or that today, we're going to be reading about her class, or school letting out for good. Chapter 13. Excuse me. Ever since I'd started doing interviews, people in Magnora sometimes came up to me and told me I had done well, but many of my mother's friends were scandalized that I had shown my face on TV. Some even said that she would go to hell for not raising me better, and although my mother never said anything to me, I knew she would probably have preferred I had worn a veil. But even if my mother disagreed with my choice, and even if her friends criticized her, she stood behind me. So if you remember a lot of the women are now wearing burqas where they can only see out through a little grill in their, with mesh. So no, you can't even see their skin. Well, Malala's wearing just a headscarf so you can see her face. And that's what her friends think that is absolutely scandalous and terrible, that she's showing her face. Meanwhile, even some of my friends asked why I let the world see my face. Fazula's men wear masks, I said, because they're criminals. But I've nothing to hide. I've done nothing wrong. I'm proud to be a voice speaking out for girls' education and proud to show my identity. A madman was about to kick more than 50,000 girls out of school in a matter of days, and all people seemed to want to talk about was whether I should have worn a veil. Meanwhile, my brother Kushal was saying that for once he wished he was a girl so he didn't have to go to school. I wondered sometimes if the world had turned upside down. My mother and father liked to watch my interviews, but I usually ran out of the room when they came on TV. I always liked to give interviews because I knew how important it was to speak for girls' rights, but I never liked to watch them. I don't know why. It was fine for the whole world to see me. I just didn't want to see myself. And I suppose I have to admit that I'm a lot like those people who were so preoccupied with my appearance. And I suddenly noticed all kinds of things about my looks. Things that had never much bothered me before. My skin was too dark. My eyebrows were too thick. One of my eyes was smaller than the other, and I hated the little moles that dotted my cheek. A couple of days before the official school closing, my father was going to Peshawar to meet two video journalists from the New York Times, and I went with him. They had invited my father to ask if they could follow him on the last day of school, but at the end of the meeting, one of them turned to me and asked, "What would you do if there comes a day when you can't go back to your valley and school?" Because I was both stubborn and full of hope, I replied, "That will not happen." He insisted it might, and I started to weep. I think it was then that they decided to focus their documentary on me as well. The morning of our last day at school, a two-man camera crew appeared at our house. I was still sleeping when they arrived. They told my father they were there to document my day from start to finish. He was surprised. He had agreed to cameras in his school, not his home. I heard him try to talk the reporter out of the idea. Eventually, he gave in, and the filming began. "They cannot stop me. I will get my education," I told the cameraman. "If it is in home, school, or any place, this is our request to the world. Save our schools, save our Pakistan, save our Swat." I sounded hopeful, but in my heart I was worried. As my father looked at me smiling uncomfortably with a mixture of pride and sadness for his daughter, I pictured myself stuck at home, reading whatever books I could find until I ran out of books. I was 11 years old. Was my schooling really going to end now? Was I going to end up like girls who quit school to cook and clean? What I did know was that my words would reach or didn't know was that my words would reach many ears, some in distant parts of the world, some right in Swat, in Taliban strongholds. Later, as my friends and I passed through the school gate and the video camera recorded our every move, it felt as if we were going to a funeral. Our dreams were dying. 2/3 of the students stayed home that day, even though we'd all vowed to be there for the last day. Then one of the girls burst through the doors. Her father and brothers had forbidden her from going to school, but as soon as they left for the day, she snuck out. What a strange world it was when a girl who wanted to go to school had to defy militants with machine guns, as well as her own family. As the day went on, teachers tried to act as if everything were normal. Some even gave us homework as if they'd be seeing us again after winter vacation. Finally, the bell rang for the last time, and Madame Miriam announced it was the end of the term. But unlike in other years, no date was announced for the start of the next term. My friends and I all stood in the courtyard hugging one another, too sad to leave. Then we all made a decision. We would make our last day our best. We stayed late just to make it last as long as possible. We went over to the elementary school building where we'd all started as children and played games we'd played when we were little. Mango Mango, Hopscotch, Parpar Toonie. We played silly games, sang nonsense rhymes, and pretended that, at least for those few hours, there was no Taliban. Unfortunately, on that day, Moniba was not talking to me because we'd had a fight a few days earlier. When I got home, I cried and cried. My mother cried too. But when my father came home, he said, "Don't worry, Johnny. You will go to school." But he was worried. The boys' school would reopen after the winter holiday, but the closing of the girls' school meant a significant loss of income, which he needed to pay teachers their salaries and the rents for the buildings. As usual, many of the families were behind in their tuition payments, and others had stopped paying when Fazula issued his edict. My father had spent the last few days before the holiday trying to find a way to pay the rents, the utility bills, and the teachers' salaries. The night air was full of artillery fire, and I woke up 3 times. The next morning, my family and I talked half-heartedly about leaving Swat or sending me to a boarding school far away. But, as my father said, Swat was our home. We would stand by her in this time of trouble. So, at the end of this chapter, her family's feeling pretty defeated. They don't know if they can even afford to keep the school doors open for the boys, to pay the teachers, to pay the rent for the buildings. None of that. People aren't paying. Girls can't go to school. So they're like, do we stay and endure this? Or do we leave or send Malala somewhere so she can at least get an education? And her dad just said Swat is their home and they would stand by her in the time of trouble. If you notice the pronoun her, a lot of times when they're talking about countries or, and this is just in life in general, or like America, they talk about America, it's always the pronoun her that they use for a country. So just kind of an interesting little note. So we'll move on to chapter 14.